Thank you all so much for being so obedient of an audience. I really appreciate it. This is our very last session, and the session is going to be run slightly differently from the last two, insofar as it'll be more of a roundtable discussion. And let me just introduce our moderator and chair for the session. The only man on the panel is my good friend and colleague, Bob Wekesa. Bob is currently the director of the Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS as we call it, my alma mater, where I did my PhD. And Bob has been a longstanding member of the Chinese and Africans in China Network, although now he's left the CAAC and gone to the dark side looking at the United States. We still embrace him. So Bob, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks, colleagues, for staying put, for being patient. And the refrain from just after lunch has been that, it's this panel, between this panel and wine. So without further ado, we'll go straight to the business of the panel and create as much time for wine as possible. So we have an eminent, panel of speakers for this problematizing or problematic, if you wish, panel. In fact, the panel is problematizing the Global South Roundtable. We are on a rectangular table, but that will suffice. I'll start by a very quick introduction of the panelists. We have Elena Albert, who is a research fellow with the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. She's also a PhD candidate in political science at George Washington University. We have Lina Ben Abdallah. I could have said a lot about Lina and how we got to interact in Beijing. But the wine business will not allow that. But she's she's associate professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University, and she's the author of a recent book called Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production Network. And of course, she's on the board of CAAC. We have Jordan Linton Cox, who is now my collaborator in the knowledge production think pieces that we agreed on. She is also director of research for the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University. We have Margaret Myers, whom I met sometime last year in a similar, engagement at Florida International University, and glad to be here with you again, Margaret. She's director of the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue and adjunct researcher with, now this is a bit of Spanish, so I'll go slowly a bit here and say it is Nuncio Milenio sobre los impactos de China on America Latina. Right. And lastly, we have Viola Rothschild. She is an analyst at State Department working on understanding China's foreign policy strategy and activities in the so-called Global South. So without further ado, this being the panelists, I thought we'll just do a round of introductions, then go straight into the business. The panel is, as mentioned, problematizing Global South. In the first round of questions, I will actually spell out the questions very fast, and the panelists will be at liberty to respond to any of the questions, and we'll try and cover as much ground as possible. The first question is, why is the term Global South contested from conceptual and practical viewpoints? The second one is, how do the conceptual understanding of Global South differ from the perspective of scholars and commentators from A, the Global North, B, global powers within the Global South, and C, Africa and Latin America. The third question is, should we treat China as part of the global south, or should we say now China has risen to become, it doesn't fit the description of global south? The fourth question is about what are the characteristics of the global south, particularly when distinguished from global north, plus the other terms that have come up like, developing nations, rising nations, emerging nations, and so forth. And then, of course, the other, question that we want to address in this panel is, should we also talk of, and I think this has already featured in this conference, can we talk of what do we exactly mean by global China? We use it quite a bit, but what does it mean? Can we also talk of global Latin America, global Africa? Also, these terms are used quite a bit. So terminology, as we said earlier, must be important. Then, of course, there's a question around and the understanding of global south from the perspective of its original formations of non-aligned movement, G77, Group of 77, as distinguished from newer, formations, particularly the BRICS. How do we understand that? And I think lastly, how do we understand global south from the perspective of encounters of the global south nations and their encounters with China particularly, but also as it relates to global north. So I'll start with my immediate neighbor. Then we'll move down the aisle, as it were. Thanks.
Yep, there we go. So I can address any of those. Okay. And certainly it won't be all of them. I didn't take enough notes to remember precisely what. So I mean, I've been sort of scribbling copious notes, as yesterday and today, trying to think about what I can possibly add to this discussion. And I am painfully aware of the fact that neither am I an expert on the global South, and this grouping per se, or of the history of sort of world conjuring projects, as Monica called it earlier. But this is something, I have been looking in a lot of depth, mostly from a policy perspective, right, at the use of this term, of interpretations of this term among, global South actors and those outside of the global South, right, as it were. And specifically, given where I sit, at sort of interpretations of this concept by the U.S., how this, developments within the global South, so-called global South groupings, narratives about the global South have evolved in recent years here in Washington, D.C., how all of this is being interpreted. I'll just make a handful of observations, none of which are necessarily linear, or coherent in terms of the narrative, and then move on to others. But I think the idea is to provoke discussion among the entirety of this group. Many of you have thought about this in tremendous depth, so I'm very much looking forward to my panelists, comments, and those of the audience as well. First of all, I would simply say, as we all know, that this term has made a linguistic comeback, right? It's not a new term. This is something that originated, as I understand it, in the 1960s and gained traction again in the 1980s with a report on the time by the German Chancellor, but has been embraced in wide-ranging narratives, including within the United Nations, where there are, in fact, working groups on, Global South working groups by leaders of individual countries, including here in the U.S. Biden has used the term. The UN been used within wide-ranging UN meetings. Certainly, multilateral development banks have also used Global South, and then the G77 has also used Global South to characterize itself and the sort of grouping that it represents. There I would also mention that, you cannot, this is extensively mentioned in different forms, starting with South-South cooperation, but now increasingly Global South as of this year in Chinese policy documents. It's well embraced and is very much part of China's foreign policy toward several parts of the world. The concept of the Global South, though, is a problematic one from a lot of different perspectives. On the one hand, it incorporates a hugely diverse group of countries with wide-ranging political systems, diverse economic systems, right, and many, many other differences that, are very apparent to all of us in the room. And we need only look at just as was mentioned, Bob's important question about, whether China is part of the Global South, whether many other of the countries that are, conceptually part of this grouping ought to be part of this grouping, given the wide-ranging economic and other, huge, huge growth rates in some of these countries, real struggles in others, and wide-ranging view, variation in views on other topics. The concept itself also implies a degree of policy convergence or a common agenda, and indeed here too there is considerable variation and diversity with countries in the same region, right? Even diverging considerably in views and values and practices and in policy. We've also seen, and I think this is really fascinating, some debate among, so-called Global South nations about who, conceptually belongs to the Global South. Russia's use of the term is really quite interesting. It's moved beyond now the use of Global South to the use of world majority in an effort to include itself, first of all, in this notion of Global South or of this broader configuration, but also to distinguish the Global South and the world majority as singularly focused, despite other differences of opinion or of structural differences in these countries, of all being focused on developing a world order that rejects the U.S. as a leader of that world order, as being not reliant upon the U.S. or aligned with U.S. views of the global order. So that in itself is a very interesting sort of parallel narrative to all of this. The attention paid to the Global South of late and to Global South groupings, thinking of the BRICS here, right, has on the one hand seemingly elevated, in my view at least, right, issues of common and broad concern to a number of these countries, right, whether we're talking about the weaponization of the U.S. dollar, right, which has been a longstanding issue of concern to many of the countries involved, the underrepresentation of developing countries, right, in international organizations, or broadly speaking in global fora, or even, as was mentioned, right, a sort of renewed interest in active non-alignment. We've seen a lot more discussion of this of late, whether in the Latin American context or more broadly. This is not a new concept by any means, but certainly we've seen a resurgence of thinking about this in the context of, great power competition now between the U.S. and China. On the other hand, this concept and discussions in Global South related fora, right, highlight areas of divergence too. Certainly all these countries feel differently about what would presumably be a China-led order, right? You see this major variation in thinking even among BRICS nations about, whether a China-led or China-dominated agenda is a good idea or not. India stands out on the one hand, and others in other areas, right? Whether a common currency or a new approach to the international monetary system is something that ought to be approached with seriousness, right? Interest in expanding the group, the BRICS in particular, right, has been a a point of contention for existing members. There is huge divergence across the, so-called global South on Ukraine and other issues of international importance. And so in general, this concept of the global South is a poor predictor of a nation's strategic alignment. Oh, I'm done. Got it. All right. I'll stop right there. Move on.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob. Thanks, Margaret, for kicking us off. I will preface my remarks with a reminder that I am here in a purely personal capacity. I am not in any form a State Department spokesperson. So big disclaimer. I've been working at the State Department for less than a year, which is far less time than I spent in academia before that. So I'm still sort of working on how to best bridge that gap and parse my words. But I'm primarily a China analyst who looks at PRC foreign policy strategy and activities in the so-called global South, particularly Africa. And so I want to spend my time talking about sort of China's role and positioning in this larger, hugely problematic construct that we often refer to as the global South. And we'll pick up on a couple threads that Margaret laid down. Of course, we've been seeing China represent itself as a developing country, as an ally, and as a development model for lower income countries for a long time. But they haven't used the term global South much until relatively recently, just in the last couple of years, really. So broadly speaking, how do the Chinese understand the global South? On one hand, some officials view it as a Western conception used to divide and weaken the camp of developing countries and sort of force countries to choose between the US and China. More recently, we've seen officials, including Xi Jinping and Wang Yi, lean into the global South grouping and refer to China as the largest developing country and a natural member or leader of the global South. According to the MFA, to China, the global South is the family of emerging markets and developing countries. So there's been an evolution there. I think this is something that Eleanor will talk about in more depth. But I wanted to talk about one of the projects that I've been working on recently. I've been trying to sort of compare and contrast through close readings of open source official speeches and documents, how top leaders are thinking about PRC foreign policy, what they've accomplished, what their goals and intentions are moving forward. For instance, there was a central conference on work relating to foreign affairs that was last December. The last one was 5 years ago in 2018. So how, sort of what's changed, what stayed the same, what are the trends that we're seeing, and really trying to dissect some of these things. And that's just one example. I went through a lot of documents, but one of the most relevant trends to this discussion that came out of this exercise is just that the PRC is clearly increasingly framing itself as the moral leader of an emergent global consensus that excludes the US and is backed by its allies in the global South, Latin America, Middle East, Africa. And in this narrative, the PRC really stresses, the troubled and turbulent nature of current times, war, climate crises, pandemics, inequality. And, this is all a product of the existing Western-led international system. And the PRC is presenting itself not only as an alternative, but a solution to this current chaos. And their message is pretty straightforward. It's that, the unipolar, hegemonic, US-led world order has gotten us here to this sort of chaotic inflection point. And we, leading a multipolar world where developing countries have a voice, will lead us to a better, safer, more equal future. How? Well, of course, through the suite of neatly packaged PRC-led global initiatives, global development initiatives, civilization initiative, security initiative, the BRI. These things give us a sort of convenient roadmap on how to get there. And in this story, it's sort of interestingly PRC morality that allows them to triumph and to appeal to other countries and eventually win a global consensus backed by countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And these consensuses are increasingly being forged in non-Western-led international fora, in the G77 and BRICS. And the US is increasingly isolated and out of touch. A perfect example is the snapshot of the US, vetoing ceasefire resolution votes in the UN, going completely against the majority. And that is sort of, China China will use that as, case in point of this this picture that they're painting. And in the UN, the PRC is the champion of the global South. It sticks up for the little guys. It advocates for increasing the participation of countries that have been historically, marginalized and ignored by US and the West. And I think, and we know from conversations with foreign counterparts that a lot of this messaging is landing with audiences in the so-called global South. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the new Gallup polls that just came out. China edging out the US and 30-some African countries in overall favorability, which is not to say these relationships are perfect, far from it, but clearly something is sort of working there. And I'll just end with a few thoughts on what the implications are for China's engagement with the global South. I think first, more than ever, China is depending on this grouping of countries for political support, not only in multilateral fora, but also for its new initiatives that they're trying to take global and are incredibly important to PRC leadership. They're looking to try to shore up support on PRC core interests. The Xinjiang issue is super important because China needs the support, or at least not the explicit condemnation of countries with significant Muslim populations. They want support for China's particular definition of human rights. They want support for their claim on Taiwan and the One China principle. And China has been shaping and reshaping multilateral organizations to meet these ends. The PRC pushes for expansion and reform in the UN Human Rights Council and the Security Council. They say things like the Security Council should not become a club of big countries or rich countries. There's a special emphasis on Africa. They propose using global governance reforms to redress the historical injustices done to Africa, to make special arrangements to meet Africa's aspirations as a priority. But there are frictions too. China's claim to being a member of the global South is tenuous. It's constantly trying to hang on to this developing country status. Of course, there are benefits that come with that status, but more importantly, probably, if they're not a developing country, then what happens to the claims of them being a peer and sort of truly representative of a spokesperson of this block of countries? So also, like, the expectations of being a leader of a global consensus are really high. If they're going to talk the talk, they have to walk the walk. That's a problem. And then finally, a lot of these relationships have economic foundations. And we're arriving at this sort of interesting point where Chinese lending to a lot of these countries is starting to change. Those patterns are starting to change. So I think it'll be really interesting over the next couple months and years to sort of see where these patterns take us. But I will give it to Eleanor.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to Bob and Yun and my panelists. I'm really looking forward to both hope to contribute and not just echo some of the themes that have already been explored. But a caveat aside, the whole other panels have been very much focused on kind of trans-regionalism. I study China in its state behavior in a UN system that is statist by design. So caveat aside, I use it kind of as a forum and a lens to view kind of how different regions can be conceptualized in the global South through the UN system. But I'm going to use most of my time to kind of just look at unpacking how China views the global South, building on some of what Viola has said. So a little clarity, right? Global South is common speak now, whether it's policy circles, academic circles. But as we've all talked about, it's really broad. Don't really know what it is, who's a part of it. But it's by and large some shorthand for developing countries from all of the regions we're here to talk about today. So in Mandarin, global South is often literally translated as Quanqiu Nanfang. And I think it really adopts the intentionally far-reaching scope, right? That's still, we need to say, as Viola said, this has not been common political vernacular for China until last year, I'd say. If you don't have Xi Jinping and his top officials using the word global South, it doesn't really matter. All the South-South cooperation comes before it, but just to give a snapshot of how it wasn't really part of the discourse, people who study China will look at the CNKI database, which is a huge hub that collects policy journals, newspapers, etc. It's basically your one repository for all the things you can search on. But if you looked for the term global South in 2001, you'd maybe find 3 articles. That increases to maybe 12.5 by 2018. But last year there were 143. And in these first 4 months, there have already been 60. So that's a lot. That's not to say that the idea or the concepts of global North and global South, or even global East and global West, haven't been a part of the Chinese discussion about its relationship with the world. Deng Xiaoping in the 80s hinted at the importance of South-South cooperation as a conduit for global economic development. But again, the more novel uses and utterances of Global South really came at the BRICS Business Forum last year, when Wang Yi came out kind of foreshadowing that China was this natural member, given that it is the largest developing country. Xi Jinping at the closing says, China breathes the same breath with other developing countries as a member of the Global South, right? They pursue a shared future with them. And then in March of this year, Wang Yi says, China is, and will be a steadfast member of the Global South. So instead of kind of creating this tenuous, like, oh, it's China and the Global South, there's kind of starting to be a shift in saying, no, we are in it. It's not just us on the side. Now, that's just still rhetorical speak. There's plenty of other questions about what that engagement then looks like. But I think when we want to think about whether it should be considered, I think in China, it's a place of a lot of contradictions. You can live in the dialectic. Two things can be true at the same time, even if you think they are not. This is fundamentally in like Chinese political blood and their culture. It is how they think about things a lot of the time. So, but if we wanted to think about some organizing principles of whether China belongs in this grouping, I kind of gathered together 3 little metrics we could look at. So you have development metrics as one, official rhetoric as another, and then kind of maybe institutional or organizational preferences of how they engage with the outside world. So if we want to look at developmental benchmarks first, obviously China is the 2nd largest economy in the world. Okay. Then it lifts, 770 million people out of poverty. You've eradicated extreme poverty. Does that make you still part of this global South by developmental standards? You could look at the Human Development Index, but it's increased a lot. And so that comes out of UN metrics. So it'd be hard if you looked at these to say that China hasn't transformed completely. And so maybe this claim of being a long-standing part of this global South or South-South solidarity, maybe a little bit of a tenuous link. But there's no doubt that rhetorically, China really envisions and places itself within this world. That doesn't mean that it didn't have a lot of skepticism about the Western origins and that it might be kind of used as a splitter to try and divide its relationships with all of these regions. But I think overall we can see, oh, time's already up. Okay. I can round it up. Okay. Anyways, I had this whole thing about things that Chinese authors are saying, but I'll say quickly, just I think one way to look at what authors are saying, so not just academics and not just speeches, you can see that there's a big turn to trying to embrace South-South membership and this global South membership, and to use it as a strategic pillar for how it engages. So I see it as this big umbrella and all of these other institutional organizations under it, whether that's non-alignment movement, whether that's G77, whether that's BRICS, New Development Bank, all of these kind of sub-regional groupings as well, they all link back to the central kind of UN institutional culture. But I think China's still trying to figure out how it wants to do this. And the rhetoric change, I think, is the big signal. And we kind of watch what happens from here.
Yeah, so just to clarify, are we still talking about the opening remarks, or do you also want us to talk about, okay, so we're also going to do the... Okay. Okay, so I think it might be, I don't know, I'm coming from a very different perspective, right? So I would say that, so I'm not a policy person. I'm an anthropologist, and I would say I'm an anthropologist that is a Caribbeanist who happens to study China's influence in the Caribbean rather than a China scholar who's studying the Caribbean. And I think that perspective really guides how I think about the region, and specifically how I think about these like terminologies, which there have been many terminologies over time that have been basically used as solidarity movements, right? Ways in which to create kind kind of connections between people who have been historically marginalized. And I think that is a part of the Global South that we do need to still think about, is that these ideas do come from a historical formation of disinvestment, of colonialism, that created this kind of conceptualization of the North versus the South, extraction versus domination, right? And so I think we do, and I think people on the ground do think about or are aware of the implications of that. And so while we can think about how China is utilizing those ideas, I think we also have to think about how nations who are often post-colonial nations, and so that's also another formation that people use to think about Pan-Africanist, but who gets left out of Pan-Africanist, post-colonial nations, but who gets what kinds of post-colonies, right? All of these are ways of kind of trying to grapple with racial capitalism and its geographies. And so I don't actually have a solution. I think a little bit about global China versus global Asia, and how in academia, the literature on global Asia tends to be, in my experience, out of the humanities, and is really thinking about kind of like more of a ethnic studies kind of conceptualization of connectivity, often, and kind of critique, versus maybe what we're discussing right now is global China. And so I think that I don't necessarily have solutions at this moment, but I do think that we should be attentive to what we do lose, and what we gain, who's erased and who is centered with the usage of these terminologies. And especially, I think, like, we all know that China is very attentive to words. And so that means that there has to be a currency for those words to be utilized. And so I think we should also think about the currency that existed before, and why people mobilized around these terms. And so that's kind of what I have. But I think my later remarks might reveal a little bit more about like my thinking, because again, very different space. Anthropology is a very different space than the policy space. So I think there's a little bit of difference here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and my remarks will echo what Jordan just said here, because I also come to this from a more or less an academic kind of scholarly perspective, thinking about the Global South and thinking about this concept of the Global South in my research, in conversation with other scholars. Where does this contestation come from? And I think a lot of it is those of us who use the concept in teaching and in research, and those of us who contest the concept. There is an uneasiness about using the Global South a lot of times because it is a homogenizing concept, because it is a shorthand, right? Because we're talking about vast diverse groups and communities, polities, peoples, and systems of thought that we're all lumping together in one concept that we will call the Global South. And then you get to have these questions about what do you mean about is this geographically, does Australia count? These are the typical questions we always get, right? So do countries in the Gulf count as part of the Global South? What do we mean by Global South? And so I think it's that homogenizing kind of aspect to the concept that brings a lot of the sources to its contestation in this kind of scholarly kind of community. And I agree that it just really presents a lot of challenges, right? So that we always have to caveat really what we mean by the Global South. And I will give kind of the definitions that I rely on for what the Global South is and how it works for me in that sense. But before that, another source of frustration is also just the fluidity, right? In terms of sometimes it just represents kind of a statist way of looking at the world if we think about it from this global North versus global South, whereas just to give an example, even if one was focusing on a single country, let's say one studies China, if you were studying how China is experienced, for example, in Vietnam or in Philippines, right? It is fundamentally, by necessity, going to be a different experience of China when looked at how China is experienced in Angola, for example, or in Algeria, right? So we might all be identifying these places as part of the Global South, but at the same time, it's that homogenizing and that lack of fluidity, right? That it's an imposition, right? So these concepts become constraining. It's a constraining kind of, identity that we impose on these regions and areas and peoples and communities that we study. I think a lot of that, frustration, I think, comes from this, especially in scholarly work. Now, in terms of the way I view kind of the definitions that I lean on in terms of the way I conceptualize the Global South, I will just name a couple of scholars here whose work I think has been quite helpful to me. First is the definition of Global South by Siba Gruvugi. I think Shobana mentioned Siba yesterday. And Siba Gruvugi says, basically, the Global South, we shouldn't think about it as a directional. It's not a geography. It's not a place. It's not a directional designation of something that's due south from its kind of northern other. But he thinks about it, and I agree, as sort of a symbolic designation, which is meant to capture, and I quote from his work here, the semblance of cohesion that emerged when former colonial entities engaged in political projects of decolonization and moved toward the realization of post-colonial international order, end quote. And this move, right, this productive kind of aspect of the Global South as this project of reordering. It's a project of a reordering. It's a world-making sense, in the world-making sense, right? And then the other really cool definition of the Global South that I use, especially in my classes when I'm teaching even things on international development or teach on Global South to my students, I encourage them to think with Alina Sajid, who writes that in her definition of the Global South, she says it's not just about these spaces, right, that are referred to as former colonial, societies or formerly sort of like the third world, right, concept. But she says, and I quote here, it's also spaces in the north that are characterized by exploitation, oppression, and neo-colonial relations, such as indigenous and Black communities, immigrant communities in Western societies, some spaces that kind of, it can be thought about as sort of these areas, right? So of ambiguous and political economic spaces because of these rapid processes of modernization, we leave some communities out, right? And she includes and incorporates that in her definition of the Global South, right? When she thinks about immigrant populations in the US, or she thinks about indigenous populations, right? So, and it's a very inclusive, expansive way of thinking about the Global South. So in the spirit even of thinking about trans-regionalism as an ethos, as a method, opening up the conversation, not closing it down. I don't want to kind of fixate what the Global South is in a broader sense, right? But just really opening it up and leaving it open for kind of discussing these concepts more or less as Gruvugi says, these are symbolic designations, right? This is symbolic designation. It's not a geographic, it's not a directional designation. And I think that, this is in some ways, to me, the purchase, the value added of thinking about the Global South. Some scholars are not using the terminology global majority, which I think is also useful because it wants to suggest that it's not a pejorative way of thinking about world or reordering or ordering or position in the world. It's actually the majority by population, by number of countries, by whichever way you want to cut it. It is the majority. It's the global majority. So that's again another one of these concepts that can be thought of as a symbolic designation, right, and not necessarily directional sense. But I think what's really interesting to me is to think about what is the source of affinity? What is these sources that drive these affinities between communities when we think about indigenous populations and peoples all across, or when we think about even the solidarity, the Bandung, sort of these moments and movements in history that kind of really propel these north-south and also south-south affinity. So, all right, I'll stop
here. I think the first round of applause. I think the audience, you must be actively participating in the very good vibe we are getting from you. I guess we've learned quite a bit from the first round of interventions and discussions. We now move into the second round, and I'll start with Margaret. Again, my immediate neighbor. There was that whole question of what are the mechanisms, avenues, channels through which global China engages with Latin America and So similarly, how, Latin America and Caribbean, as Jordan has reminded us, responds the agency from the region towards China. If you can help us address that in about 5 minutes, that would be great. Thanks.
Sure, I'll try to be a lot more succinct this time. So, how does China not engage with Latin America? I think I've been looking at China-Latin America relations for the dialogue for 13 years and prior to that for 4 years. So it's been a long time of tracking this relationship. And of course, when I first started looking at it, I was just talking to some folks in the audience. It was largely a trade-based dynamic. That's really what continues to underpin the relationship, frankly, but that was the story then. And since then, we see such wide-ranging engagement really in all spaces. Economic drivers, of course, are such a very big part of this, whether we're talking about, early 2000s, policy bank engagement, as Monica mentioned that earlier, right? To a much wider range of financing options. Now, if we're talking about companies in all forms, right? Whether SOEs or private companies engaging in what was once a very extensive focus on agriculture and extractive industries to now a focus on ever higher value added goods and services. We are seeing, we see what I call a proliferation of diplomatic actors really that has exploded on the ground since probably around 2017 is when a year that we saw, in conjunction with the Belt and Road Initiative and in a focus on people-to-people engagement, an expansion of party actors, state actors, quasi-governmental actors, other forms of diplomatic engagement, NGOs, cultural engagement, educational partnerships, really. These were all things that have been there for a very long time, but the extent of it now is just so fascinating, right? And really remarkable. And just as was mentioned in a number of the presentations, we have moved from a preference to state-to-state engagement to a much more localized focus, whether we're talking about at the state or provincial level or at the municipal level. And so the question, I think, is not where, but we're not, right? Are we seeing engagement in different forms? Of course, this varies considerably on a country-by-country basis. Even within countries, there's considerable variation, and the effects are very different, as are the interests, whether we're talking from an economic or political perspective, and I won't go through all of that, or even my 5 phases in China-Latin America engagement. I'll spare you that. I wanted to say one thing, just in reference to some of I think about this often just because of where I sit, obviously, about sort of the risks of U.S. conceptualizations of the global South. And we haven't talked about that all that much, right? And I think there are kind of 2 ways that the U.S. views this. Either it's sort of dismissive of this notion of the global South or of global South groupings, for example, the BRICS, right? Suggesting that there's little coherence, right? And we've mentioned this, there isn't a lot of necessarily alignment in views, aside from, in some interest in expressing solidarity, as was mentioned, but, and that was on full display at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, in all honesty, right? We didn't see a lot of alignment of views there, aside from an interest in demonstrating that there is there is commitment to this institution, right? And that there is a common path forward, but that is not yet well defined. So a tendency as a result of that to sort of dismiss this institution as dysfunctional. The challenge there is that there is a simultaneous tendency to ignore what this represents, right? Which in many ways could be boiled down probably way too simplistically, right? To a real dissatisfaction and deep concern with the current global order and the way things are being done. And ignoring that comes at the risk of doing bad policy, for lack of better words, right? So there's that risk. The other risk is a tendency, I think, and we saw this in the Cold War era, and we're risking, I think, repeating this again, to treat the third world, as it was known, at the time, as a sort of indistinguishable, undifferentiated terrain, right, for superpower competition. And I think here again, so if I'm talking about Latin America in particular, there is a sort of singular policy toward Latin America at the moment with some differentiation here and there. But really, in my view, the Latin America policy is at this point a China policy. The US Latin America policy, that is at this point largely a China policy, or if we're looking now at some of the bills that have been put forth, a economic security policy, but with China competition in mind. So this is, we're risking this yet again. So it's not necessarily global South specific, but it's a pointing a broad brush, right, or painting the whole thing with a broad brush. And so there are two sort of simultaneous and yet different risks that come with, you know, this notion of the global South as a whole, indistinguishable, whether we see it as you know, as clearly articulated or not.
No, thanks for actually expounding and expanding on that you know, perspective. As you are in the earlier part of your intervention, I thought you were describing part of China-Africa relations. You know, all those channels of soft power, people to people, state to, you know, and they look quite similar. But I think transitioning to Viola, if you could help us understand the whole notion of Global South as a formation. I think we've already problematized it in terms of not, you know, being a generalization and so forth. But, you know, on the basis of the institutions that kind of undergird it or form its foundation, the non-aligned movement, the G77 vis-a-vis the more recent BRICS and so forth. And this whole notion or question of the whole notion of Global South, non-aligned movement, G77, BRICS, kind of drifting away from the UN system. I think we do have the, you know, Summit of the Future in September, which is supposed to look at reform of the UN system. And I think the thought, particularly from some quarters of the world, is that all these are pulling away from, you know, a system that was created by the United States. So your perspectives on that, yeah.
Thanks. And I think, Margaret, you did a great job sort of outlining some of those institutions and how the U.S. Looks at them. And so I just wanted to pick up on, you know, some of the conversations that I've been in over and over again, sort of looking at this issue of, okay, so these countries are drifting farther and farther away from the U.S. and the UN system. Like, what do we do about it? And so in meetings with policymakers, and I remember I'm not a policymaker, but you know, the same sets of questions and around it, how to engage with these countries, just come up over and over again. And so I think just some of my observations have been, you know, here are the challenges that we face. You know, what is our comparative advantage? What can we offer to these states compared to what China is offering, especially when our hands are tied when it comes to different restrictions and conditions that we have to abide for better or for worse. You know, when our bureaucratic processes are slower, that the alternative that we're offering is more expensive. You know, it's a tough sell. Blinken and other senior officials at the State Department and elsewhere have said on several occasions, you know, we don't want to make them being the Global South choose, but we want to make sure that they have a choice. But it's really tough to make a competitive offer. And I think that is something that we're still trying to figure out how to do effectively. Often these countries would rather work with us or our allies, but it's too difficult for various reasons. There are too many obstacles. It takes too long. It's too expensive. And working with China is sort of the path of least resistance. It's easier. Another challenge, I think, you know, how can we or should we point out some of the negative effects of these countries working with China, and how do we do that in a way that does not come off as horribly condescending and patronizing, which of course sort of plays directly into the PRC narrative, and like they are sort of right in some. But I think that often these governments know what they're signing up for. They aren't naive. And I think sort of building on what Luna was saying, yes, China is on the supply side, but it's really important to consider who is on the demand side as well. And not to strip agency from the countries in the global south that China is engaging with. More often than not, leaders in these countries know that PRC companies are engaging in things like illegal fishing or mining or logging that are bad for the environment. They know that if they contract a Chinese company to outfit a building with Chinese telecoms and tech, that there are going to be data security and privacy implications. They know that if they take a big loan, even if it is, has pretty good concessional terms, that it might be tough to pay it back. It's sort of being able to assess what these host governments know, what their risk tolerance is, who the decision makers are in these separate places, and what their motivation is, and how to best engage with them, if at all, on these topics, I think is really, really tough and really difficult. And it's very easy to sort of come off as with, finger wagging and with not much to offer in exchange. And I think here too is where the global south stuff becomes really problematic. I don't think that we being at state use global south too much, but just structurally the way that the regional bureaus are broken up. AF is all of sub-Saharan Africa. WHA is Western Hemisphere Affairs, which I think much to the horror of Latin Americans here is Central America, South America, the Caribbean, but also Canada and the Arctic, super similar. I think, and these regions are subdivided. We do have experts and really good people that know this stuff. I think often the problem is that the higher up these messages go, people just have like increasingly limited time and bandwidth, and the issues and messages that we're passing up lose sort of a layer of nuance each time they're escalated, which is then becomes what you hear, and are like, oh my God. I think also there's always the challenge of limited resources. There's a constant challenge on how to decide how these resources are allocated. There's a horrible term that people in the state use, which is like rack and stack countries by priority. Where do we have relatively strong relationships? What countries are sort of so far gone that it's not worth sort of trying to engage with them further in certain areas? Where is at risk? Where do we prioritize because things like critical minerals or a big pending infrastructure project is at play? Not all these countries have the same relationship with China either, and China and Africa too is a horrible conceit that we sort of all fall victim to. But I think tailoring messages and engagements to specific contexts is so important, and something that we can and need to do a lot better. And yeah, that seems like a good place to end.
Sorry for being a brutal timekeeper, but the wine is waiting for us. Right, and in fact, as you're very interesting stuff. Only in August 2022, the US released its Africa strategy. In that strategy, we saw a line there saying the US will engage with Africa on its own terms, not competing with anybody else. But only a short while later, we saw all this flurry of projects, countering malign Russian and Chinese influence in Africa. So it looks like policy and practice don't seem to go in tandem, which is quite interesting. We could go on. But I think let's come to Elena, and if you can help us on the basis of the question we shared. But really, the whole issue of seeing as you are you work with the US-China dialogue, is there any possibility of meaningful dialogue between China and the US in Latin America and Africa? I can see, Jamie is familiar with these discussions we've had. Which areas can the US and China work together in Africa? and probably in Latin America. So if you can help us understand that, but also, of course, then the same question of reform of global governance, the future summit. Thank you.
Easiest question of the day so far. I would say I'm not particularly optimistic about the US and China being the drivers for cooperation on some issues in these regions, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be agency for these countries to engage with both of them to get things that they want, because they all have and both the US and China have interests in there being stability in places where there's conflict, right? In providing development where there are places that need it. It's just about managing the competitive dynamics, which clearly we have a lot of work to do. I think in terms of thinking about, reforming global governance and international order, there's a first thing that we need to acknowledge that, I'm saying something to be a little bit provocative, but I think the idea of the rules-based international order or the liberal international order are mythologies, and they are taken for granted as given. But if you speak to anyone at a UN institution or an agency, all of that is contested every day. It has been ever since it's been created. And even in some of my interviews, I spoke with someone who said, well, actually it's the US and the Europeans who are the revisionists, because they keep pushing and pushing and pushing the agenda for an institution that wasn't necessarily created to do some of the work that it tried to carve out for itself. And it has resource limitations, right? And so if you have an expanding mandate for things, but you don't have tools to do it financially, and then you have a country like China that all of a sudden has transformed its budgetary contributions and its role in the world, well, it wants a say in what these institutions are going to be doing. And so it straddles this weird line of being a P5 country and a major budgetary contributor, but also being the developing country that says we were cut out of the writing of the rules of most of this. And so it's going through a very slow process of trying to push the interpretations of the types of international norms that I think in the West we think are established, but these are actually contested. So easy examples would be issues like human rights. The UN is also created on a set of pillars, right? You have the development side, human rights side, peace and security side. These often are presented as being equal. I think the Chinese would say they are either not necessarily conditional or stepped, but there's some that become a precursor. You need to have one before you can have some of the others, right? And so I think there's just a fundamentally different vision of how you get the things that you want these institutions to do. Now, I would actually push against a little bit and say that I don't think the ideas of the global South and these identity markers that are symbolic, I don't think it's actually pulling away from the UN system. I think it's just trying to have a reckoning of what the UN system should be. So I'll leave it at that. I think that's provocative enough. Maybe there'll be enough time for my other panelists to speak, and maybe we'll get some questions.
Well done on the question, yeah.
All right, I think it would actually make more sense if Lena went first, if you're okay with that. Yeah.
I do have the question.
Yes. All right.
I like, I like that you trust me with that. The question. All right. I got it. Okay, so the question is, now that there is a split in interests in the global South, on the one hand, we have a view that suggests that through solidarity, the three regions, Africa, China, Latin America, are amassing sort of global power, and these regions are being enabled to assertively demand for a more equitable global governance system. Yet, on the other hand, there's a view that these smaller nations, particularly in Africa and Latin America, are playing second fiddle, lending their power to bigger global South powers with little or no benefit to these small powers. So how do we think about this? How do we determine? So these questions, how do we proceed sort of from this, thinking about questions of agency, thinking about questions of how do we kind of reconcile this? This is the question. And I think to me, what I want to bring this question back to is really that I would like to maybe push back a bit against this question and say that like that really the post-colonial global order, right, is not isolated from the structure of global politics and the politics that we exist in right now. So I guess any alternative order or alternative institutions, alternative ways of models of doing things cannot be dissociated, right? They cannot be totally delinked in a radical sense from the existing order that we all are so, we're also entangled in and and submerged within. So I think from this perspective, then I submit that simple sort of iterations or narratives about China as an alternative is by definition sort of a flat proposition. It's a flat question, right? That we don't live in any neutral space where China's influence is going to change things in a kind of, it's not going to, it can't rid itself of its own entanglements in the neoliberal order, right, and its institutions, right? So we really cannot speak about this independent variable, right, which is China's insert something that China did and then try to isolate the consequences or really read into that sort of what are the effects or what are that's a causal kind of link in that flat sense. So I think I want to push against sort of these questions about thinking, what this binary way of thinking about the world order and the global south, right? Is it really doing everything that it's supposed to be doing versus the doomsday kind of, reading of the failure of this alternative from bringing some independence that I think is just the questions, cannot be asked in this way, I think. But also I think in conversation with what Yasser was presenting about earlier when he mentioned and he talked about sort of the Bandung conference and the Bandung spirit in terms of those principles of coexistence, right? I think even we can take the example of Bandung because it is thought of as the sort of, it's a milestone, right? It's the start, it's the kind of the catalyst for this South-South cooperation, the solidarity. But even in Bandung, right, there wasn't really it wasn't revolutionizing the way we think about sovereignty. It wasn't saying we shouldn't think about Westphalia, we shouldn't accept Westphalian sovereignty. It didn't say that, right? It's really not pushing things to this very radical sense of let's throw away Westphalian sovereignty. What it said was, let's extend Westphalian sovereignty to include all of these colonial or colonized kind of, polities, communities, and peoples, right? So it's in a way thinking about these alternatives that are still embedded within these structures, right? So at some point, we really need to think about it in the sense and not there's option A and then there's option B and they are so separate we can do an experimental kind of, that's just not a possible, a feasible way to think about it. And I think it's because of that entanglement within this neoliberal order and its institutions that this project is bound to be associated to, right? So there's this assimilation of South-South cooperation within the UN system. So the UN basically takes over, right, this discourse about South-South cooperation, and it dilutes it, right? It takes away its ideological kind of world-making sense, and it makes it into this technical language about knowledge produced in the South, by the South, South-South, right? And it removes all that politics away from it. It makes it this technical exchange, right? And it's that assimilation, right? It's the assimilation of this language into the neoliberal kind of institution of the UN that just renders it, in a way, this kind of flat South-South cooperation that's doomed to create the same language. Why are we talking about small states and big states? It's because we are using the same terminologies, we're using the same way of thinking about the world that is premised on this kind of big power versus, whereas if we flipped it and then we thought about sort of even what, Caitlin was talking about earlier, right? These circulations of knowledge, right? Where in Cameroon, right, you think about how the medical teams from Cameroon were necessary to the success of these medical missions because they were using sort of systems of knowledge that were local to the areas, and they were helping in making, right, and informing the medical practices from the Chinese side, right? So there's so we can rid ourselves of these categories of small powers versus big powers, and then we can think about these circulations in a different way. I think could be more productive. So Jordan, over to you.
Yeah, so the question that I was asked to kind of chew on was what are some of the theories, concepts, and methodologies that can be leveraged to trans-regional and interdisciplinary studies of the Global South / Global China on one hand and Africa and Latin America on the other hand. And I think something that correct me if I'm wrong, Lena, that I think you're kind of teasing out is like the kind of multi-scalar implementation of these terms by different actors, right? What the actors on the ground are doing and these circulations, which are like a lens to think about it versus like how this gets operationalized in like the UN or these geopolitical spaces, these kind of top-down spaces. And so I think some things, would you say that's correct? Okay. So as context, I'm coming from actually, ironically, like a UN kind of, we were talking about the Escazú agreement in at the same time as UN COP, I think it's COP 30 was happening in Chile. And so it was really interesting to actually see this operationalized, to see the ways in which a kind of regional global South formation did and did not work. Right, the ways in which certain nation states were kind of obscured, but also the ways in which actual regional transformation was possible. And so it's these kind of two things that I think is the work of all of us. Like we're always grappling with these two like levers of the messiness, right? And so I think when I'm thinking about theoretical and methodological interventions, I think about the traditions of kind of post-colonial studies. And I think about the traditions of Caribbeanists as a really interesting way of, because post-colonial scholars have always delved into the messiness. Like the messiness, the in-between, as Homi Bhabha talks about, is actually the nexus of the engagement. It is not the thing that we lean away from, it is the thing that we lean actually into, right? We lean into the hybridities, right? As Stuart Hall and many others talked about, right? So we lean into this messiness, and through this messiness, we're able to think of these multiple scales. And I think as an anthropologist, as an anthropologist who imagines themselves at the intersection of the transatlantic and the transpacific, because I do work on the Caribbean and China, and the messiness that occurs at the two nexuses of those points that are often theoretically thought of as completely dissimilar, right? I think about what it looks like, or that our methodologies and our theories actually need to lean into this messiness, right? And so rather than global China, I think about global Chinas, as Monica talked about earlier, right? Or as I feel like the panel before us was actually a brilliant kind of exposition of exactly what we must do, right? In order to actually kind of really think through this messiness, but also to elevate the ways in which people on the ground versus political interveners are actually utilizing and thinking about these terms, because they also are. I think about the term diaspora when I think about the kind of conflicts of the global South versus the global North, because it's also a term that we've often had, like, does it do anything? Does it do too much? Who can be it, right? These terms that are really sticky, and so then we don't know whether to keep them or to throw them away. And so I want to think about a little bit about this concept of global Chinas, and what that helps us to think about. So thinking about not one level of China, but thinking about multiple Chinas, multiple iterations, multiple interventions in these regions, but also thinking about at this current moment, there being multiple Chinas, right? So the difference between migrant laborers, the PRC state, multinational combination state, multinational corporations, state-owned corporations, locally chartered corporations, right? And how each of these also are different actors. And those are also multiple Chinas. I also want to remind us of kind of thinking about multiple Chinas through kind of a historical lens too, to remind us that these moments, as Lena kind of mentioned before, are not current moments only, but they are actually layered moments, historically layered intimacies that have, so when we think about China's at the present, we also think of China's of the past, but then that means also we have to think about Europe and European colonization, and we have to think about American interventionism as all part of layered kind of interventions that are occurring and people are experiencing and talking about. As Vivian talked about, like people are talking about the history that we have to wade through. So I think about people who have done this well. I think about Lisa Lowe. I think about Melissa McCulley in Distant Shores. But I also think about like folks from Asian American studies like Gary Okahiro in Margins and Mainstream, where he argues that we need to think about when and where we enter. So pulling from a Black scholar, Julia Cooper Smith, and also what yellow, Black and white mean. I think about racial capitalism, which he also is kind of evoking in these ideas. I also think about a Caribbeanist term, ghost hegemonies, the ways in which colonial imperialism, layers upon current moment. So I think we need to think about all of this, and I'll leave with one idea. Shumei Shi and Francois Lionnet argue that not South-South, but we should start thinking about minor to minor. And so maybe this is another way that we can navigate these terms. A colleague of mine, Dinashri Thorat, have also been thinking about South by South, so American Souths versus global South formations and the ways in which they have actually been historically co-constructed through labor formation. So I think there are things that we can do here theoretically, and happy to talk more about that in the questions.
Thanks. I think another round of applause, please. I think we are on course to meet our target and, transition to the interesting part of the day. Because we have 10 minutes of question and answer. Jordan, I was tempted to give you a little more time, particularly when I saw some people applaud about some scholars you cited. But I was like, no, look, we have rules and I will stick, we'll stick to them. But I'm certain to, so a very quick round of, 3 quick questions from the audience. Will, you introduce yourself, point to the person you want to respond to the question, make it short, and then we'll take things from there. Any questions? Okay. Next to Mike here. Okay, and then Vivian, anybody else? So let me take over from there. We have the 3 questions then. Yeah.
Okay. Mine isn't so much a question, but just a comment and to really applaud Jordan's final intervention, because as everyone else was talking, I was thinking that I don't think that's what I meant when I wrote this panel just title. And I think that is kind of the point of my comment, is that our own conceptualizations and understandings of terms like global South, global North, global Africa, or China really seem to depend on the discipline that we come from and our own training. And when I was originally thinking about global China as a concept, and again, in quotation marks, right? It was kind of a counter to the term global China Inc. That's been used in, covers of magazines and things like that. And this idea that in Africa, in Latin America, China as a concept is kind of homogenized and it's turned into the state, right? It's the Chinese state, it's the Chinese party that is doing all of these things. And as a migration scholar, but for me, global China is my kind of counter kind of point to China Inc., right? When I talk about global China, I mean the PRC, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Chinese who are moving to Africa from Malaysia or from the United States or Canada, right? They're like multiple Chinese-nesses as well as in South Africa. The Chinese South Africans that are third and fourth generation Taiwanese South Africans, and now mainland Chinese who have been in South Africa for 20 years and now have had children in South Africa, right? So the multiple forms of Chineseness that exist in one place, right? As well as, I think several of you mentioned, Chinese multinationals, Chinese NGOs, Chinese doctors and scientists, right? So that to me, when I thought about global China, when I thought about this question, that's kind of what I was thinking about. But I find it fascinating that depending on the world that you inhabit, right, your use of these terms is very different. So.
Thanks, Yun. I think. I almost cut Yun short, but I realized, she's the organizer of this panel.
Thank you so much. Just a funny anecdote. In grad school, I applied for a conference called Southern Capitalisms, and they had their poster had a picture of Lagos. And then when I arrived to this conference of PhD students, it was all about the American South. And I was the only one, but it was precisely very interesting because of all these conceptual linkages. And so one of the things I wanted to say and that I'm very much appreciate about on this panel is thinking about the Global South as this moving category, not just a geographically bounded, like we can see it on a map of the world and then colored in, but rather set of relations. And so I'm not a performance studies scholar, but, in terms of anthropology, I come from that. Thinking is just from what I see of all of what's really interesting from all of these is that there's these moments of deployment, like people are deploying the term at different moments. And so to understand what it means, it always is so contextual. Who is saying, is it, a State Department report? Who is saying, or someone within the State Department report who has a dissenting view of what that might mean, or more complicated, right? So it's interesting just to hear all of this in its fullness. And I guess for us trying to think about, the moments of when it is being, what kind of histories is it hearkening? Sometimes it's flattening, sometimes it's, pointing towards a certain region or a certain historical moment. So it's kind of these moments and performance in a generative sense, not like everyone's faking it, but more it's actually doing something and they're making a world.
We'll take the last question or comment, and then you can respond, to anything or add anything. Then we close there. So over to you, Locke. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, this is so generative, in terms of the conversations and the kind of debates, that are going on here. Really appreciate that. I guess there are a couple of, they're still kind of bubbling. The thoughts are still kind of, gelling in my head. Couple of things. I think of the Global South, discourses of the Global South as being sort of a posturing, right? As you said, a symbolic kind of thing. And it's from the Chinese angle, it's a political positioning, right? That they're staking, right? And that's happening on that end, on the one side. I'm thinking about the discourse, also in a performative level of global China or global Chinas, and what, I'm not, on the one hand, I can see the utility of talking about it as such, as sort of like I think of like Americanization, right? The discourses of Americanization and the whole discussion we had, in the 2000s around, is globalization Americanization? And so we're at this point, global China is sort of like, is this new era then about global China, a movement of global China? But my concern here is, and I bring this with an ethnic studies lens, is that the conflation of the state, of the commercial kind of enterprises, corporations, transnational capital, and people. And thinking about the anti-Chinese, violence, anti-Asian violence that is happening all over the world because of these conflations that are happening. And I am concerned about the slippage, of that, and how easily it becomes, what is the impact of it, not just on a state to state level, but on an everyday racializing kind of bodies level, right? And when we do that, so that's one of my concerns. I want to bring our attention to, and what are we doing when we actually use those terms? There was a third part, but I've forgotten now. Maybe I'll come back. Yeah.
I don't even know if this mic works. Okay, it does. No, I almost after one. But yeah, like when you were talking, I'm thinking about so Xue Meishe is somebody I talked about early in her article, like about Sinophone studies against diaspora, thinking about the Sinophone instead of China and what that does and what that doesn't do, as far as like thinking about there's also like the discussion of the periphery versus the core, right? And so I think grappling with these because an issue is in the region, like in Latin America and the Caribbean, as many of the scholars in the previous round talked about, these categories get collapsed. And they get collapsed through a lens of yellow peril, which still exists, right? Talking about those ghost hegemonies, that's one that got left behind, right? And it's still haunting everywhere. And so I think about how do we recognize and also the other thing that I've been thinking about is the fact that there can be actors and agents that get subsumed into the narrative of the Chinese state that are actually acting like quasi independently for their own purposes. So I've talked about earlier, like the fact that there's a lot of Chinese owned enterprises or even actually non-Chinese owned enterprises, like locally chartered businesses that get like subsumed into the idea of the BRI when they're just kind of doing stuff. One example that I think about, it was so interesting. So there was a Canadian, when I was doing field work, there was a Canadian man, so a man from Canada whose family was from Taiwan, who came to Jamaica to utilize the idea of Chineseness in order to get tax exemptions to sell luxury cars. Right? So he was like, I can get these tax exemptions to sell these luxury cars. And so I'm going to just like, you don't know who I am. I'm just come like also me, right? And then he decided that like the luxury cars were actually like Jamaican roads were too terrible for Lamborghinis. And so he was actually going to use Jamaica as a hub to get his cars tax-free to Jamaica and then move those cars to Lagos where he could sell them. Now, like, what do we do with that, right? Within this idea of like non-state, like very much non-state actors, but who are still utilizing and manipulating these like both like political categories, also like these ideas of Asianness. And so I think people are both acted upon in ways and acting in ways. And so maybe the Chinas gets at this, maybe the Sinophone gets at this. I'm not quite sure, but I think that's something that we definitely need to chew on, because one thing that we do need to be clear is that people are not only acted upon, people also act. And so how do we, sorry.
Anybody else?
Yeah. I just wanted to briefly talk about the sort of racialization aspect that you were talking about. I'm a political scientist by training, so I probably will not speak in the vocabulary that a lot of you are using, but so like before I went to the State Department, I never called China like the PRC before. I'd always just called it China. I'm Chinese, or my mom is Chinese, and there is this sort of ongoing effort now to like be more careful with language. I mean, I think we hear a lot in like the China studies world, don't conflate like Chinese people with the CCP. I mean, I think this is sort of the like State Department version of that. So call, when we're talking about the Chinese state, call them the PRC. And then if we're talking about, Chinese people, Chinese students, Chinese language, Chinese culture, you use Chinese. And that's actually something that's been now sort of like codified. And something, very much adjusting to a new vocabulary there as well. But I I take your point. I think that a lot of that language came from a sort of bottom-up movement from Asian American employees at the State Department long before my time there. But there's been, and this is like well documented in the open source, but sort of, assignment restrictions put on, Chinese Americans, diplomats that, aren't allowed to serve in certain places. The security clearance process is incredibly onerous, for people of Chinese descent who have family in China. I think there's, some reason there, but it also, doesn't feel great. Anyway, so I think just the point is, like, I take your point, and I think it's super important to both like institutionally and sort of individually, really sort of try to pick this stuff apart. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, I think Lena, you. Go ahead. Oh, okay.
I just wanted to add a quick note, similarly, on thinking about, attributing things to the Chinese state. I think there's a co-constitutive dynamic between the US as the pseudo leader of the global north and, the beacon of the liberal international order, and among the more competitive dynamics that are emerging that reinforces this idea of a Chinese plot to supplant or undo. And I don't know, I've been studying how China talks about this and thinks about this. Like, they don't really know what that alternative is. They know what it's not, right? It's not what the US is offering consistently. But I think there's a real lack of understanding how slow the policy process in the Chinese side can be. And so the efforts that it's doing are really experimental, right? It does this on the domestic policy side. It does this in the foreign policy side. It has written a handful of UN resolutions in the security space and the human rights space. It's done much more in the UNGA, but that's a little less, that's more symbolic than kind of cutting teeth on policy shaping and agenda shaping. And so I think it's important that as much as we want to say that it can be the state is of course many actors and people, but it's also not just a state acting alone to talk about international order. It's the dynamic between where the tension and contestation is. And so I think one of the reasons that I chose the UN is because it's a place where the contestation is contained. It doesn't have all the scale or challenges in the same way. But I think it's important to view these different spaces where contestation takes place and where we can focus on who the actors are doing it.
Very briefly to echo some of these sentiments, but to say to Yoon and Locke's kind of the comments and that you made, both made me kind of think about this angle of sort of the ethics of research, right? So bringing it back to sort of scholarly kind of research and thinking about the ethics of the topics we research, the questions we ask, and thinking about how they exist in a political discourse, right? They're not isolated from kind of the world around them. And sometimes it's important to think about ethics in the sense of, right? So I think the questions that were posed here are extremely on point because they really reflect sort of the, in the discipline. This is how it's talked about in political science, right? It's China as an alternative. And it just is somehow this product that is neat and packaged and completely different from the institutions within which it operates. What is that alternative, right? So we have to demystify, push against sort of these conceptualizations that are in this kind of binary, that disregard kind of what it means at the end of the day. What does it mean for the broader concept of, anti-China sentiments, for example, to produce a particular set of research that I think from my isolated perspective, it's just intellectually fascinating, but we have to include that ethical dimension to the research. We have to ask these questions. We have to contextualize the research in a broader kind of, and I think that this is the conversations we're having kind of facilitate bringing those different dimensions to what we're doing. I think it's important.
There's absolutely no room for any further intervention.
In the end. Oh, wait, you're giving me the mic? No.
It's not possible to usurp the role of the moderator. But colleagues, thank you very much for your interventions. I'm sure there are many other perspectives that we can follow up through the wine session, which follows immediately after this. But to our dear audience, thank you also for being very attentive. And if we could, a round of applause as we leave the stage. Thank you.